Hello and welcome on into episode 16 of the That Movie Is Ours Now podcast. My name is David Sugarman. If it's your first time here, thanks for stopping by. It's really nice to meet you. And if you're coming back, it's really good to see you again wherever you're watching this or listening to this. Like, subscribe, leave a review or a comment if you like what you hear. It helps other people hopefully find something they would like to watch and or listen to. And if you're a fan of the Hunger Games, I think you'll like to listen to this episode because I am with Dan Monahan, better known as Real Takes on TikTok and Instagram. He is one part of the Goodwill podcasting podcast. A lot of podcasting that I just said there. And we are deep diving in on the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I really enjoyed this film. Some problems as well, and I just really enjoyed this conversation with Dan. I like his reviews because they are nuanced and they are thoughtful, and he's got strong opinions, but they are always really well informed, and that's what this conversation felt like. Just two guys who really enjoyed the new Hunger Games and dove all the way in. Spoiler warning, I think there's one in there as well, but if you haven't seen it yet, it's been out for almost a month, but totally okay if you haven't been able to get to it. So if you haven't seen it and you don't want to get stuff spoiled, go away, come on back. You can subscribe and then come on back to watch it at a later time. But Dan, awesome guy, nice guy, almost 2,500 followers on TikTok. He is really just rapidly growing and putting out just a really amazing, thoughtful, opinionated content on film and even TV shows. It looks like every single day. This is a guy who's really working hard and really dedicated. And happy that he is on the podcast today. He is my guest. Let's not wait any longer. Let's get into it. This week's guest on the That Movie Is Ours Now podcast, Dan Monahan, a.k.a. Real Takes. And here he is, Real Takes today. We'll just call him Dan Monahan, one half of the Goodwill podcasting podcast with Connor Crumman. Dan, thanks so much for hopping on the podcast today.
Absolutely, David. It's great to be here. Looking forward to talk about this. A lot to get into here, so really looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're discussing the latest installment of the Hunger Games franchise, the prequel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, set 64 years before the original trilogy. Been out for a few weeks by the time this come out, I think almost a month. But if you haven't seen it, this is your spoiler warning. Giving everyone a moment. Do you have a joke to tell or something? Like while this is like while they have a chance to get out and decide if they want to stay. Do you have what's like?
I got no jokes, but this is definitely a good movie to have a spoiler warning for. There's so much happening here. Hopefully most people have seen it by now, but if you haven't, definitely make the time to check it out.
Okay, that was a sufficient amount of time. It's more people more than people usually get on YouTube or on TikTok or wherever. So let's dive on in. Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Just you walked out of the theater and thought, what?
You know, sadly, I think as I was walking out of the theater, I was thinking about how much I felt like the ending was mishandled. And I think that goes a lot into kind of the character decisions. So to kind of rewind a little bit, I did like this movie. I think I would honestly prefer watching this to anything in the trilogy. I think it was a lot of fun. The performances were good, but it really gets lost in my opinion at the end. So I think that was kind of the pervasive thought in my mind as I was leaving. What about you?
So I had trouble with not so much the ending scene, but the third act as a whole. I do like the circular storytelling, of him getting all the way back to the capital ultimately. But it felt like there were multiple logical ending points. It could have ended when the snake bit his hand in the woods and bit Snow's hands in the woods, and he loses Lucy Gray, at least for the time being. It could have ended when he poisons Casca Highbottom. It could have ended his conversation with Gaul. And I don't think as it kept going, I said, yes, it could have ended here and not a ton, more was ultimately added through the next 20, 30, however many minutes it was. And I think one of the things I really wanted to ask you about, I've read a lot about the romance between Lucy Gray and Snow, and that it really gets leaned on hard in the third act. I don't think it's good. I don't think there's a lot of romantic tension there. I don't think there's a lot of chemistry. However, I was wondering, is that the point? Because they're both sort of working in their minds, specifically Snow. You see the gears turning. Are they just using each other? Do they love each other? Is it a little bit of both? And I think I had trouble because in the third act, it really leans on the two of them and their relationship.
Yeah, and see, I think that's kind of where the problem lies. And for me, I think I have a little bit of a different feeling. I think they, in my opinion, they had decent chemistry throughout, and I think the slow way that it kind of developed with him kind of starting out as seeing her as obviously a tool to use for his own advancement, but I feel like there was a little bit of mutual respect that was developed. There was obviously some sacrifice from both of them for the other one that wasn't always fully necessary. And I think I believed it, which is why I guess this is kind of an alternate viewpoint to you, but I felt like the heel turn at the end was like ridiculous. I, and I think if he is willing to sacrifice everything he sacrificed and walk away with her, if he doesn't, if he is not doing that for the sole purpose of finding those weapons, which he wasn't, like that's just not, that wasn't his purpose. Why does he react in any way other than, oh, here are the weapons, like let's get rid of these and keep going? Like that was so strange to me and so jarring. Like that conflict felt so manufactured to me, and I think that like the way it fell apart so quickly with both of them just being like, ah, no, like forget this person immediately. Um, I just was like, what was the point of everything we've watched leading up to this and all that development?
Not
Um,
only that, but I think in addition to that, obviously Snow is young and he's a kid in this movie, and so we're seeing, some mistakes can be forgiven. However, when he makes the what it turns out to be kind of a fatal mistake and says, "I killed three people," and and then he says, "Well, I killed my former self." She says, "What do you mean you only killed two people?" We're meant to believe he is and we see it in real time. He is a bit of a tactical mastermind, and of course, what he becomes is a real political genius in that way, and a manipulator. So the idea that this is where he would trip up was a little bit, felt a little bit forced. And I appreciated that, they're trying to tie it in with a hanging tree song, but that felt it just felt a little bit, like I said, between finding the weapons in the cabin and then that there were a few things that felt a little bit forced to move the story forward.
yeah, from if we're to believe he is who he presents himself to be, there's no way he's making that mistake in that
Mm.
conversation. Like that's just so simple. Um, and I thought like that explanation he gave was just so crazy. I cringed. I was like, bro, please stop. Um, but and it's a shame because I really like I like a lot of the writing in the movie. I liked a lot of the dialogue. It didn't feel corny. Um, I'd heard I think some criticism about Rachel Zegler. Kind of, there's a lot of that in general, but I didn't think she was bad in this movie at all. So when the dialogue started to get a little choppy at the end, I was just like kind of frustrated. But I'm with you in terms of I don't think he would make that mistake either. I think that was a bit silly, and it felt like they were reaching for a way to get to a conclusion that they had, but the path to that conclusion was not well thought out.
Let's flip it on its head a little bit because you've already said it and I've talked about it. I really did overall enjoy this movie. I think for the sake of ratings, I think I gave it like 4 out of 5 stars. Um, and the first thing as I was watching throughout, before you get into the deeper themes of the film, world building is kind of like a cheesy, overused term for, and if, world building is just an excuse to make more prequels and sequels sometimes. But I appreciate it. It's obviously a somewhat familiar world, but it's set 60 something years, 64 years before, and you see all the things that are not there yet. The technology, right? The water bottles flying in, that wasn't there yet. The idea of the pageantry and the showmanship and the idea that, you got Lucky Flickerman and Schwartzman, by the way, fantastic, was hilarious at every
Yeah.
turn. They're trying to drum up interest so badly. You can tell like interest in the games is not really there, which is such a far cry from what we get when we see the original Hunger Games trilogy. So I appreciated they didn't just say, well, the Hunger Games have always sort of been a hit with the people. There
Mhm.
was actually a kind of a natural development, and you can see it happening, a seed of what's happening and how it ends up leading to the 74th and 5th and so on Hunger Games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one aspect of that maybe I not necessarily struggled with, but I thought was curious. I think the amount of development that goes into the games themselves, like they literally were basically just in a the Coliseum
Mhm.
in this film. Like there's no, um, the whole world that gets constructed for them to fight in the not so distant future. Do you think that felt like reasonably far away in terms of their like technology and how this might have progressed, or do you think that felt like a stretch that they get to that incredibly complex um, system world for them to fight in the near future?
Yeah, maybe you have to add a little suspension of disbelief, but generally, I think it worked. As far as the idea that I mean, think about the technology we had 50,
Hmm.
60 something years ago, and things that wouldn't have been imaginable for our parents and our grandparents. And I think so. The idea, especially in a sci-fi world, that 60 years from now, that they would, be in a I think in the first one, they're in sort of a large, call it a forest preserve, maybe. And sure, there's and in a way, they're almost using like AI to make like the different animals and different things that's going on. So I think technology wise, a lot of that actually worked for me. And I did appreciate actually what you were talking about, that it is very bare bones. It's a very even before the arena is bombed, it's kind of, I think I called it in a review, like an empty basketball arena. It's kind of just an empty space, and they'll throw some weapons in there, um, and let them go and let them fight to the death. So I think that really worked for me. And one thing that was on my mind a lot. She doesn't have a big role. I don't even remember the tribute's name, but there was a girl in the games, and I think it was good for representation, but also good to show the sort of barbarity of the game. Was a girl who seemingly had some kind of special needs in the
Hmm.
games. I don't know if it looked like maybe Down syndrome, but I'm
Hmm.
not positive on that. And it wasn't like a representation for a checkbox for checkbox sake. I think it showed again the sort of cruel nature of the games. Like, hey, your name's picked, you're going in. It doesn't matter. And I actually think they handled her death really well, her being mauled by the snakes.
Hmm.
Because I saw this and I was like, oh, I really like this. But are we gonna watch in a PG-13 movie, somebody kill her? And I thought that
Hmm.
was the best way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think with something like that, I think representation is always important because you want anything you're watching to be a representation of the real
Mhm.
world. And like, um, everyone does not look the same in the real world. Everyone does not act the same. Like it's people are people. So I like that. It didn't feel like exploitative. It felt natural. And like you said, it was just kind of like it shows, um, just how like uncaring it was. I mean, they were. I mean, it was not. It was very obvious they were treated like animals. I mean, they literally were
Mhm.
put in a zoo and put on
Right.
display. Um, they weren't treated like people. I think that just shows like they were all viewed under kind of the same lens, which I think uh, happens all the time in human history and happens now. So I think it's this movie coming out now. I think it's very timely for a lot of reasons, but I think that's exactly what you said. I mean, they just weren't viewed like you or I view people.
And you made a really good point there in terms of everybody being lumped together, even more so because in the original trilogy, in the films, and even I haven't read the prequel, but in the original books as well, even though all the districts have to send two tributes, there's a clear difference between districts 1 and 2 and 12. Those kids are trained and they're well fed, and while they're still district, they are, they're much wealthier and upper class. Whereas here, everybody was just called district, and even Sejanus's friend from District 2, is very poor and very bare bones, and doesn't have any more skills or strength, at least not through training or class or circumstance, than anyone else. And I thought that was a really interesting intentional choice that they said, they're all district. They're all, it's district versus capital. It's us versus them. Even towards the end, when Lucy Gray says, well, what if we could just stay here and, we could run off together? And he's like, well, the capital's not great, but at least it's civilized. And
Yeah.
so there was such a even more clear divide. Whereas before it felt like District 1 was almost an extension of the capital. Now it's, me versus you, us versus them down the middle, and really pushing forward the class warfare themes.
Yeah, and I think it's like very slightly there, but as time passes and as you get into the regular trilogy and whatnot, it's like the further you get from the capital, the further out you are in terms of district number, the less, the farther removed you are from like civilization or having access to like better resources, and it just like gets worse and worse to where District 12 is just basically slave labor, and no one has really much of anything. Like they barely even have food to food to eat, food for their families. So I think yeah, all the class warfare allegories in this are like very heavy handed, but again relevant and interesting, I think.
Yeah, and as far as heavy-handed, because I agree, sometimes it's on the nose. But I also was thinking, I went back and rewatched the original, I guess, original four movies, not original trilogy, a few months ago, and I said a little heavy-handed, but also at 13 or 14, I probably wasn't thinking that, and I might have,
Yeah.
not that 13-year-olds are stupid, but they might need something that's slightly more
Yeah.
on the nose, and sometimes subtlety. I think sometimes subtlety and snobbery can go together. Like you can be subtle, but sometimes if you want to say something, I think sometimes just say it. It doesn't always have to be like the most hidden messages. Don't you want people to understand your message? And there's no mistaking what the Hunger Games is trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's the story is built on the concept of the games themselves, which are what they are. And I think that's something I also was trying to keep in mind watching this was, and even the theater I was in, it was young, like it was really young. Like most people were younger than me. Not that I'm like old, but um, I'm 30, and like there was definitely a younger skewed audience. And I think, um, first of all, I think that's good. I mean, you want younger people going to the movies, like especially for a movie that's, it's this is long. Like it's a long movie. I think sometimes studios get really concerned with holding people's attention, and that's such a fear. And this might have been along a little bit to its detriment. It might have, I think, maybe lost some people's attention, but I still appreciate them taking the time. Like there was character development, there was an actual story. It wasn't just like Gen Z bullshit like images to just like keep you staring at the screen. It was like there was something real happening. So I appreciate that. I think it's good, and the movie is doing well and deservedly so, I think.
Yeah, and I'd even seen the director Francis Lawrence had said on a couple different interviews that splitting Mockingjay into two was a mistake for a bunch of reasons. And so when they brought up the idea, because this is the longest book, of doing that to him, he kind of vetoed it right away. Do I still think it's probably a little too long? Yes, but I can appreciate, especially because it wasn't just unnecessary in terms of the story. All those two-parter YA films are a little manipulative and a little cash grabby, and so I can kind of appreciate that he was said screw it, and if it's going to be a little long, it's going to be a little long. Does that mean some of the fat couldn't have been trimmed off? No, but I do appreciate, especially because he had done three of these movies. Sounds like they gave him some free reign and some creative freedom in that way, which isn't a given. So even if I wish it was maybe 15, 20 minutes shorter, I kind of appreciate that he said, I'm going to do it my way. I feel like I made a mistake, and this is my chance to right that.
Yeah, I will say, I think maybe to give kind of an alternate viewpoint, I think the shame in that is that the decision with Mockingjay, I would assume, was more so pressure from outside sources and like
Yes.
studio pressure to just make a truckload of money, which they did. But I think the shame is that I would have watched this split into two, and I think it would have been warranted. I think a lot of that third act feels like a different movie.
Mm-hmm.
It feel in the way it's shot, in the setting, in the tone, in the dynamic between the characters. It feels different, um, And I didn't really like, I didn't dislike the whole third act, but I was like, this feels like it could be its own story. And then I think all of that stuff I'm talking about, where why are these characters acting like this? This feels forced, stupid, rushed. Like, if you have time to flesh that out, and it's, four or five conversations where you see small changes, where you see little nuanced things that like make you feel like, okay, there's something's changing here in the dynamic. Like, I think that would be more interesting, and they could have told more of the story after. I would have felt like it was more warranted here. But I think maybe in his mind, like you said, he was aware of that mistake from before.
Mm.
So I think sometimes maybe there can be like a fear of making the same mistakes, or like almost an overcorrection. But we got what we got, and it's still was solid. But I think I would have watched this split into two, honestly.
I hear that, and honestly, like if there was a story that ended shortly after the games, maybe once he's sent
Hmm.
off to be a peacekeeper, him being a
Exactly.
peacekeeper, and then a return to the capital and a training under Gaul, to tack on some more, to really see him form into, the President Snow we would grow to hate and love, I guess, because I liked him
Yeah.
as a villain. Would make a lot of sense. One really strong point I did want to bring up in the third act, I kind of haven't stopped thinking about Sejanus Plinth, specifically in the third act. I thought he was he was in a bit of an allegory. I thought for people who, good people who try to become maybe police officers or get into government, and but with a tremendous amount of privilege, because I think his heart was in the right place. But by the time we meet him, he's been in the capital longer than he was in the district. He's benefited from, the rebellion. It's not his fault, but his father, I don't think it's brought up a lot in the movie, but his father sold weapons to the capital in the rebellion that crushed District 13. So he, again, not his fault, but benefited from the rebellion, has the luxury of, calling out the barbarity of the Hunger Games. And then once he's actually a peacekeeper and says, I'm going to make change, he realizes, oh my goodness, like the system at play is so flawed and it's so screwed, that he thinks the only way is to then help out people, in 12 that are rebelling. And of course, that goes horribly wrong. But I was looking at him, particularly when they're having the conversation that Snow records on the Jabberjay. And I thought, oh, this feels like privileged people who get into, again, with the right intentions. Maybe they become a police officer, maybe they get into local government, and they realize, oh, it's so hard to make change because the systems that are way bigger and way above all of us, are totally fundamentally screwed.
Yeah. And I think you you also can kind of see what you're talking about in that scene, um, when they're at the bar, like in the back, and the two murders occur, and he's
Mhm.
there, and he's kind of like, she's like shell shocked, like he doesn't understand. I think maybe the level of anger and like discontent on the one side, and that while he might have some kind of idealistic image of like, how helping should look, and like it's just going to be peaceful, and we're just going to run away and it'll be fine, like those people are like actually about that life, like they're
Right.
not, they're done, they're fed up. um there's going to be violence, and he seems so naive in that scene. He just kept being like, oh, I didn't think it was going to be this way. He's like crying. It's just like, um it's like a naive, sheltered kind of viewpoint, I think. And I feel like, if you want to be that person, like he probably should have just gone all into being a rebel. Or like Corleone said, be like, stay in the shadows on your side, like use your money, use your influence,
Mhm.
find actual ways to do something and be patient. And I think if he had had that approach, he maybe could have been successful and done some good, but he just um, approached it in the wrong way.
Yeah, definitely. I think the reason, honestly, that I thought about him a lot is like on a personal. I think it made me address like my own privilege and things that I thought about, or the way I viewed the world. Particularly, I still got blind spots and stuff. I'm sure I see incorrectly, but particularly when I was like in college and coming out of college. And I was lucky enough to have the tremendous privilege to view the world in a certain way because I grew up not wanting for anything. Luckily, I was able to go to a nice college and all that sort of stuff. And so, your viewpoint in your world is very small and you're a little sheltered. And then, luckily, I've lived in a few different places and have developed a little bit since. I want to talk about one or two more things, and then we'll get to some questions. We got to talk about Tom Blythe, the man who played a young President Snow. First of all, fantastic to know young President Snow had abs. Good to know he was in shape.
Gotta have
But
that first scene off the rip.
I mean, you know what, good for him.
Yeah.
I think, but I think what I really appreciate, I listened to an interview with him where he talked about so much of Snow is in the eyes, and I think I liked that he said that because as you were watching the film, not just in the words he was saying, but it really did feel like you could see the gears turning throughout, and it was very ambiguous. You were having trouble telling what is he doing for selfish reasons and to win the Plinth Prize and to survive, and what is he doing for the sake of Lucy Gray or somebody else. And I really did enjoy his performance.
Yeah, I did as well. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. I will say, in my opinion, I think the movie, and this kind of feeds into what I was talking about before, I think it leans a little too heavily into him being fairly sympathetic. I think there is there is always that selfishness. You're aware of it. It's referenced over and over again. But I feel like he makes enough decisions and has enough moments of kind of like vulnerability and like being something else that I don't like. I don't find the heel turn, like I said, that believable. And I think you know I think part of them when they're making this movie, like they want marketable characters. Like again, I think this a lot of this feels like very it does feel kind of like Gen Z, and like I think they want these like viral, likable kind of characters that like people will enjoy and gravitate towards. And I think it just went a little too far into making him likable. And I think even a lot of the stuff that he did that like went badly or had bad negative effects, like he was somewhat kind of in the right place with like his intention. So I didn't quite think they nailed all of his motivations and just actions and words. I don't know, but it was like very close. I don't know how you feel about it.
I'll push back a little. Generally, I actually thought for the most part, particularly in the first two thirds, that they did a nice job because I think he doesn't even know sometimes why he's doing certain things. And I think it's High Bottom who makes a comment, be like, oh, wouldn't it be convenient for you to get the girl and the prize? Like, so I think he doesn't even really know why he's doing certain things sometimes. And I think it goes to, I think in general, we'll all kind of in our like very simple day to day, we'll justify things that we want, right? Like if I don't want to go to the gym today, I will justify that like to myself in my head to make myself not feel bad. If I feel like I really should go. And so, put that on, on a much bigger scale, people will, they'll do awful things. Looking at the Hunger Games, they'll commit war crimes and they'll rat poison, right? They'll do all these awful things, but they'll find a way to justify them and make them sleep at night. And I think that kind of curtails to the end of the film. Look, I'm not a fan of fascism or, the ultra nationalism, but there is for a lot of people, a certain safety and comfort in that. And he can justify this to himself because of what he has gone through. So I know that was a little bit of a winding road, but I think it boils down to, I think it's very human to do something bad or do something selfish and find a way to justify it to yourself at the end of the day, because we all want to find a way to of course sleep at night and have some peace, and nobody wants to feel like they're a bad person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you kind of see, I thought it was interesting starting at the beginning with him as a child and seeing kind of his worldview get shaped by like the harshness of the world he was in. Like you can see that kind of like tense exterior kind of develop as a defense mechanism, probably to survive. And then, you know, his father gets killed by rebels. Like on some level, like that type of, I think hatred frequently comes from like moments like that where
Mhm.
you will always see people maybe in a bucket because of something that happened to you by someone that falls in that bucket, and then you're gonna have this like skewed viewpoint of like they killed my dad, and like even if it's not like he's focusing on that, like moments like that kind of stick with you, I guess, and shape you. um and I think it was kind of cool to see some of his background and see like how his worldview was shaped and how he viewed the people that um you know, the people from the districts and whatnot.
Yeah, the way again he says, hey, at least they're civilized. Some of that not go just goes to his education and what he's been taught in school, I'm sure, but also going to, you know, because one or two rebels or a group of rebels killed his father, that means all of the rebels are savages and they're all animals and they're all killers, and that's why they're in the games. I don't want to
Yeah,
take too much more time from you, but we got some good questions from TikTok. You want to learn, tell the people a little bit more about yourself? You down to answer some questions?
absolutely. Yeah.
All right, so I thought this was a really good one from Stone Medical Movie Man, fitting for our conversation. Are you team Peter or Gale? His words seems like a Gale guy, which feels like a dig. That doesn't feel like a compliment.
um I kind of like Gale. I'm not gonna lie. I think I think a lot of it goes to the performances in the movie. I think Gale like was just Peter just kind of got on my nerves a lot of the time. Um I think in the movies they also changed like they changed some things about him. Like even in the books, like him losing his leg, they just completely get rid of
Mm.
that. I think something like that adds a lot of like nuance and development to the character. I thought the most interesting period for Peta was like everything he was dealing with towards the end with like the post traumatic stress and just trying to recover. Like that felt very real. Um, and I enjoy seeing movies delve into, psychological things like that that don't always often get dealt with well. But yeah, Peta a lot of the time was just kind of like annoying to me. Man's like literally painting himself as rocks, just lying around hiding. Like he's not my kind of person all the time. Gail's definitely like right on the edge of like you know turning into what he's fighting against. I think a lot of the time, but I think he just has more of an edge and is just more interesting. And I kind of liked his dynamic more with Katniss, I guess.
That was a very strong answer, and I guess so. I guess Stone was right on on that one. From Cinematic Joshua, what are some of your hottest movie takes? So if somebody asked you for your and hot take meaning maybe just like a strong disagreement to the general public.
Um, I mean, I've talked about it. I really don't like Manchester by the Sea. I I've talked about that a good bit. I think that's something a lot of people like. A lot of people also don't really like that. I think Seven and Fight Club are kind of mid tier Fincher
Mm.
movies. I think they're both like kind of average. I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that. Um, I've talked about. I think Rogue One is the best Star Wars movie ever made. Um,
Really? I
yeah,
love, and I've seen them all. I'm not like a Star Wars nut, but I do love Rogue One. What puts Rogue One a cut above, you think, even like the original trilogy?
um, I think the original trilogy is obviously amazing, but it has that hokiness a lot of the time, and it has that like Lucas dialogue that's just so like slaps you in the face with how dumb it is and just pulls you out of whatever you're watching. Um, I think Rogue One, has some goofiness and quirkiness as well, but at its core, um, I think it shows how desperate the war is and how much of a disadvantage the rebellion actually was at, and like getting a feel like the scope of their struggle, I feel like is really well displayed in that movie. And I think a lot of times in Star Wars movies, it feels like they're kind of on even footing, or like, you know, the Empire is just so inept and ridiculous and stupid that like they're never gonna win. And I think in Rogue One it feels so dire. Um, and at the end, like there's a huge sacrifice from your heroes, and like it hits, and you get that Vader scene of him just slaughtering, everyone. Like it's just you feel like you're in a war, and that's what the movies are about at the end of the day. So
And
I go
no,
ahead.
sorry. And their sacrifice, I always think is great too, because sometimes, whether it be Star Wars or Marvel or any sort of big action superhero sci-fi, even though the world is often on the line or the galaxy, the stakes can also feel quite low. Sometimes there's often a really big disconnect, and so to have characters actually make a sacrifice and then actually pay for it, not sacrifice and then I don't know, like one of the Chris Pine Star Trek, he's brought back to life by secret blood or something. Like one of those things. Like those aren't real sacrifices. Like those don't mean a lot
Yeah,
to,
and I
to people.
and I could talk about that for ages. Like I think there's such a fear. Like in my opinion, like Game of Thrones fell apart when they brought back Jon Snow. That was
Mm.
so ridiculous. Just no consequences, no anything. Just he's back. Um, and even with Star going back to Star Wars, like a series like Ahsoka, her friend is killed at the end of the first episode, or you assume she's stabbed through the chest with a lightsaber, and literally the next episode she's just up walking around, going about her business, fine. Like that's killed every person in Star Wars that's ever been stabbed in the chest, and then you end the first episode with such a strong moment, and then just say that's not real. Everyone here is fine. It's just it ruins like and you don't need to like have everything be so dark with every character dying, but
Mhm.
like occasional moments of like severity I think are helpful for stories.
No doubt. Got two more for you from our guy Harry at Let's All Go to the Lobby. What film got you interested in discussing and analyzing film as a whole? Is there one in particular?
um I don't really think there's necessarily one in particular. I've talked about this a little bit before, but like growing up my parents were both really into movies, and they just kind of showed me all different kinds of stuff, and we would just always watch things together. um Same with books. We would always like read together, read aloud. Like just my family loves stories. So I think that was kind of ingrained in me from a young age. Growing up, I mean, my favorite movie is probably The Last Samurai. That's a movie I really love with Ken Watanabe and Tom Cruise. Um, that's one that I think was one of the first that I truly appreciated, like on a full scale, from like the cinematography to the score from Hans Zimmer to the performances, to the storytelling, like the dialogue, like everything. I feel like I could see and appreciate kind of every aspect of the filmmaking. So that could be an answer. That's still probably my favorite movie, but not really like a light switch moment of like, wow, this is really grabbing my attention now, because it's always been kind of ingrained in me.
No, I love that. And like I said, most of these things happen organically over time. So not everyone has a light switch or a light bulb moment. Last one. I really like this question from Little Katie TV. First of all, she says, love his account. Is there a movie quote that stuck with you or inspired you, and why? I'm sure you could go on for days about this, but like, what are the first couple that come to mind?
Um, First of all, thanks, Katie. I appreciate that. There's a lot. I think one moment I love. Goodwill Hunting is, as cliche as it is one of my favorite movies. And I think a lot of different moments from that movie get talked about a lot and are really memorable. But my favorite scene is the conversation by the water between
Mm.
Matt Damon and Robin Williams. And it's kind of after Matt was in his office and was mocking him for having that painting up with the guy on the boat. And he was kind of like, saying like, is this you, or are you just feeling like lost and worthless and useless, you don't have your wife, this and that, like, and Robin Williams snaps on him, and then they kind of calm down and have that conversation, and he basically just rips him apart, but like in a
Mm.
calm, subtle way. He says, if I asked you about war, you'd quote Henry V, once born to the breach. If I asked you about love, you'd tell me about a sonnet. Like you would just regurgitate stuff you've seen in books, but you don't have the life experience uh, to back any of that up. Like, you don't know what it's like, being next to your wife while she has cancer for, an extended period of time, watching her die. You don't have any of this stuff that makes a person a person. You're just kind of a compendium of knowledge that you spit out at people, to portray that you're something that you're not. And that, like, there's any quote from that sequence I absolutely love. Um, Basically just kind of taking them apart and saying, like, just shut up and live a little bit, and then speak on things when you have that perspective.
I love that, and I remember that scene. I've only seen Good Will Hunting once, but that sequence stuck with me so much because, especially, we've all been like young people who think like we know it all to an extent, and I
Mm-hmm.
think even there are times when sometimes like I get too obsessive in terms of even just like movie watching, and it's like, well, if I watch this romance and this drama and this history piece, then I'll be this wealth of knowledge, and great, I got some quotes and facts, but there's something to taking your head out of the sand and taking your head out of a film or your phone or whatever it might be, and actually like going to live. And some of that is through age. Obviously, in that movie, Robin Williams character is much older, but also there's something to, he's like, hey, I'm going to live life. I fell in love and I got my heart broken when my wife passed, and I've done some things, and and whereas Damon is sort of too afraid to actually make any mistakes or do anything.
Yeah, and if I could just make one more point to kind of tie that
Please.
up. I mentioned Manchester by the Sea earlier, not really liking that, and that was like my first video I had on TikTok that did anything in terms of like numbers, and it's pretty divisive. But I think one of my main complaints with that was I don't find Casey Affleck's performance to be anything. I don't think he's a great actor in general, but I feel like it was so empty and doesn't convey too much. But in talking about that movie, the amount of responses I got from people who said, I've been through XYZ, like people sometimes listing out like serious stuff that's happened to them, and like this depiction of grief resonated with me for this reason, and like it felt very real. It related to my experience. And like through kind of a lot of those conversations, I think that gave me a way to see like, I actually kind of feel bad for like shitting on that movie as hard as I did, to be completely real, because I didn't understand the emotional impact and like the way that resonated with so many people. And I think now I have that perspective. And I keep meaning to go back and rewatch it and see how I feel with that. And it still might not speak to me. I mean, I think I've been through my share of things in life, but nothing on the scale of that type of grief. So uh, that's just kind of an example of, tying that quote to like that movie, and just a way it makes me think about things.
Yeah, and first of all, you're not alone on that. I really tried Manchester by the Sea. It's one of the very few movies almost ever that I started and didn't finish. I was so disconnected and so frustrated from it. I got about, I don't know, maybe halfway way through, which I almost never ever do. But same deal. It's like if it's this good, or if it's at the very least, if this many people have connected with this thing, there has to be something there. And there's nothing wrong if there's nothing there for you.
Mhm.
Or you're still criticizing it, but it, like I said, it does give you perspective, and that's why, like I said, it's always good to, particularly with like film, reviews, to try and seek out people who are,
Mhm.
who disagree with you, because generally, if they disagree with you, there's probably something there. Not that you're wrong and they're right, but there's probably some seed or kernel there, at the very least, why someone connected with something and you didn't.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the only things in life that makes people unqualified to talk about movies is if they are shut off to other people's viewpoints. I think at that point you should just shut
100%.
up and just go learn how to do that and then come back, because like we all like different things, and like I enjoy talking to people about what they like, they don't like, getting their viewpoint, trying to get into their shoes. Sometimes it might change my thinking, sometimes a lot of times it won't, but like it's just a movie. You can still respect someone's viewpoint, um, and learn something from them. So um, yeah, and I think it's funny you said that, David, because I struggled so much to finish it as well. And I don't turn off movies. If I start something, I'm going to finish it, and I really wanted to turn that movie off. And I did finish it, but like I was just like, why am I watching this? Like it was a struggle. Um,
Well, we'll
So
both have to circle back and then touch base
yeah,
after
for
that.
real. Yeah. Yeah.
Dan, thanks for taking so much time today. I really appreciate it. I love your page. I love your stuff. I love how thoughtful and a lot of your reviews are. Where can people find you? Where can people find your podcast? I'll leave the links below here, but guide people in the right direction if they want more you.
Thank you, man. And same to you as well. Your stuff is awesome.
Thanks.
And thanks for having me on. But yeah, I'm just on TikTok and Instagram really. Instagram is more sporadic, but I'm trying to get consistent there. And then Connor and I are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also YouTube, Goodwill Podcasting. We're having Stone on Monday to talk through Fincher,
Oh,
so that
nice.
should be an endeavor. It's going to take some time, but should be fun. So that's what's up next.
Awesome. This has been another episode of the That Movie Is Ours Now podcast with Dan Monahan. He's real takes on TikTok and Instagram, co-host of Goodwill Podcasting. Dan, thanks so much and see you soon.
Thanks, David.